Most people think trade wars start with factories, tariffs, or angry press conferences, but this one started with a map and a frozen island most people rarely think about, Greenland. And now, almost overnight, that island has dragged the United States and the European Union into a confrontation that feels far bigger than trade. Here's what makes this moment different. When Donald Trump talks about tariffs, markets usually shrug, allies complain, and negotiators quietly get to work. But this time, the tariffs aren't about steel, cars, or subsidies. They're about pressure, political pressure. And the target isn't just Denmark, it's Europe itself. Welcome to the Strategic Geopolitics Brief, where we don't just follow headlines, we expose what they actually mean. The trigger is Greenland. Officially, it's an autonomous territory under the Kingdom of Denmark. Strategically, it's one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on Earth. It sits at the gateway to the Arctic, hosts critical U.S. military infrastructure, and is surrounded by shipping routes and untapped resources that matter more every year as ice melts and great power competition moves north. Washington knows this, Brussels knows this, and Copenhagen knows this better than anyone. Trump's move reframes the issue entirely. By threatening tariffs linked to opposition over Greenland, he is sending a message that goes far beyond trade policy. The message is simple. Geopolitical disagreement now has an economic price tag. If Europe pushes back politically, it pays commercially. That logic alarms European capitals because it breaks an unwritten rule of the transatlantic relationship that allies may argue strategically, but they don't weaponize tariffs against each other over sovereignty. This is why the European Union stepped in so quickly. What could have stayed a bilateral dispute between Washington and Denmark instantly became an EU-wide concern. If one member state can be pressured this way, all of them can. And once tariffs become tools of political coercion inside the alliance, the entire structure of EU-US relations starts to look unstable. From Europe's perspective, this isn't just about Greenland, it's about precedent. If the US can apply economic force to influence territorial or strategic decisions today, what stops similar pressure tomorrow over defense spending, China policy, or energy routes? That fear is what pulls Brussels into the fray, as CNBC put it. This is no longer about a single island, it's about whether the rules of engagement between allies are quietly changing. From Washington's side, the calculation is colder. Greenland sits at the center of future Arctic dominance. The U.S. already maintains a military presence there, but influence matters as much as bases. As Russia expands its Arctic footprint and China labels itself a near-Arctic state, control, access, and alignment in Greenland become strategic multipliers. Trump's tariffs signal that the U.S. is willing to escalate economically to secure long-term strategic advantage. Markets are watching carefully because this kind of dispute doesn't stay contained. Tariffs between the U.S. and EU ripple through supply chains, currency markets, and investor confidence. More importantly, they inject uncertainty into a relationship that underpins global trade stability. Even if the tariffs are never fully implemented, the threat alone changes calculations in boardrooms and foreign ministries. And there's a deeper layer here that often gets missed. Greenland itself has a voice. Its leadership has repeatedly rejected the idea of being bought, pressured, or traded between great powers. Yet the fact that tariffs are being discussed at all shows how smaller regions can become leverage points in larger geopolitical games, not because they want to be, but because their location makes them unavoidable. This is why this story matters far beyond headlines. It shows how economic tools are being fused with geopolitical strategy in real time. It shows how alliances are being tested not by enemies, but by friction within. And it shows that the next phase of global competition may not begin with troops or treaties, but with tariffs tied to territory. Greenland may be cold and distant, but the consequences of this standoff are neither. What's unfolding is a signal to the world that economic power is no longer just about growth or protection, it's about leverage. And once leverage becomes normalized among allies, the ground beneath the global order starts to shift quietly but permanently. This is not just a trade dispute, it's a warning about how the next era of geopolitics will be fought with pressure, economics, and strategic geography all fused into one. And that quiet shift is what makes this moment dangerous. Because once tariffs stop being economic tools and start functioning as political signals, diplomacy itself begins to change shape. Negotiations become less about compromise and more about endurance. Who can absorb pain longer? Who can signal resolve without triggering retaliation? That is exactly the dynamic now creeping into the US-EU relationship, a space that for decades was defined by coordination, not coercion. Inside Europe, the reaction is not just anger, or it's recalculation. Policymakers in Brussels are asking an uncomfortable question. If strategic disagreement can trigger economic punishment today, what does alliance solidarity actually mean tomorrow? The European Union was built to prevent its members from being picked off one by one through pressure. That is why the response has been collective and unusually firm. This is not Denmark's problem anymore. It's Europe's line in the ice. There's also a credibility issue at play. If the EU fails to respond forcefully, it signals weakness, not only to Washington, but to every external power watching how Europe defends its political autonomy. That includes Moscow and Beijing, both of whom are deeply invested in the Arctic's future. Silence or hesitation here doesn't preserve stability. It invites further testing. From Trump's perspective, this pressure-first approach fits a broader worldview. Alliances are transactional, loyalty is measurable, and strategic value must be proven, not assumed. Greenland's importance isn't symbolic, it's operational. Missile defense, early warning systems, Arctic access routes, rare Earth potential, all of it feeds into a long-term security calculation. Tariffs become the lever to accelerate outcomes that diplomacy alone might stall. But this strategy carries risk. Allies push too hard don't always bend. Sometimes they adapt. Europe is already discussing contingency planning, diversification, and defensive trade mechanisms. Once those systems harden, reversing them becomes difficult. Even if leadership changes, short-term pressure can create long-term distance. And then there's the global audience. Countries outside the transatlantic bloc are watching closely. If economic force can be used inside alliances, then neutrality becomes less safe and alignment becomes more conditional. That reshapes how middle powers think about dependency, supply chains, and strategic partnerships. The lesson being absorbed is simple. Economic exposure equals vulnerability. What makes this moment especially volatile is that it's unfolding during a period of overlapping crises, war fatigue, energy insecurity, inflation sensitivity, and rising nationalist politics. In that environment, even symbolic tariffs can trigger outsized reactions. Confidence erodes faster than markets can price it in. Greenland sits silently at the center of all this, a reminder that geography still matters in an age obsessed with algorithms and digital power. Control of space, physical space, is returning as a core driver of policy. The Arctic is no longer a future concern. It's a present battlefield of influence, and Greenland is one of its keystones. So when CNBC says Trump's Greenland tariffs have drawn the EU into the fray, that phrase understates what's really happening. This isn't a skirmish, it's a stress test of alliances, of rules, of whether economic power can replace diplomacy without breaking the system it relies on. Because once pressure becomes the language of allies, trust becomes optional. And history shows that when trust erodes, escalation doesn't announce itself loudly. It builds quietly, decision by decision, until one day the world realizes the rules changed while no one was looking. And the most unsettling part is how normalized this all feels. There was no emergency summit announced with sirens blaring, no dramatic speech declaring a rupture, just tariffs, statements, and carefully chosen words, the kind that slide into policy quietly and harden before anyone fully absorbs their consequences. That is how structural change happens in geopolitics, not with explosions, but with precedents. What Europe fears most is not the tariff itself, but the logic behind it. The idea that economic access can be conditioned on political alignment rewrites decades of alliance behavior. For the European Union, which was designed to pool sovereignty to prevent coercion, this strikes at its core philosophy. If sovereignty becomes negotiable under economic threat, then autonomy becomes theoretical. This is why officials in Brussels are framing the situation as more than trade friction. They see it as a test of strategic independence. If Europe accepts pressure now, it invites more later, and not just from Washington, but from any power capable of applying leverage. In a world where supply chains are weapons and markets are battlegrounds, credibility becomes currency. From the US side, the calculation is brutally pragmatic. Greenland's value is increasing faster than diplomacy moves. Climate change is opening Arctic routes. Military planners are recalibrating threat maps. Strategic patience is seen as a liability. Tariffs, in this worldview, are not punishment. They are accelerants. But accelerants can ignite fires that are hard to contain. Once Europe starts preparing retaliatory frameworks, defensive trade measures, or alternative partnerships, the relationship shifts permanently. Even if the tariffs are paused or withdrawn later, trust does not rebound on command. Investors remember uncertainty, governments remember pressure, institutions adapt to survive future shocks. And there's another layer that rarely makes headlines: domestic politics. Leaders on both sides are constrained by their own audiences. Backing down too quickly looks weak. Standing firm risks escalation. This trap hardens positions even when private negotiations might favor compromise. What begins as strategy turns into signaling, and signaling is notoriously difficult to reverse. Meanwhile, Greenland remains the paradox at the center of it all. It is not a bargaining chip, yet it is treated like one. Its people have consistently rejected external ownership debates, insisting on self-determination, and yet their land is being pulled into power struggles precisely because it matters so much to others. This is the modern version of great power competition: sovereignty acknowledged in principle, pressured in practice. The wider world is absorbing a lesson here. Alliances are no longer shields, they are arenas. Economic interdependence does not guarantee restraint. It can be weaponized, and geography once again dictates destiny. This is why this moment won't fade quietly. Whether the tariffs escalate or dissolve, the signal has already been sent. The boundary between economic policy and strategic coercion has been crossed, and once crossed, it's rarely uncrossed. What we're witnessing is not just tension over Greenland, it's the emergence of a harder, colder phase of global politics, where leverage replaces persuasion and pressure replaces patience. The map hasn't changed, but how power moves across it has. And that shift, more than any tariff number or diplomatic statement, is what should keep everyone watching closely. And when you pull the camera back even further, the real significance becomes impossible to ignore. This episode exposes a structural transformation in how power is exercised in the international system. For decades, economic integration was supposed to make coercion irrational. Trade would bind interests, markets would discourage escalation, interdependence would stabilize politics. What we are now seeing is the inversion of that logic. Interdependence has not removed leverage, it has multiplied it. The more connected economies become, the more pressure points exist. Greenland is not the cause of the shift, it is the catalyst revealing it. In classical geopolitics, territory mattered because it could be occupied or defended. In modern geopolitics, territory matters because it anchors systems: early warning networks, undersea cables, satellite coverage, missile defense arcs, shipping choke points, and resource access. Greenland sits at the intersection of all of these. Control does not require ownership. It requires influence, alignment, and predictability. And unpredictability is exactly what Washington is trying to eliminate. From a strategic standpoint, tariffs serve a dual function. Publicly, they are framed as economic tools. Quietly, they operate as credibility tests. Who absorbs pressure? Who fractures internally? Who stands collectively? The EU's response matters less for the immediate outcome and more for what it reveals about Europe's cohesion under stress. That is the real data being gathered. For Europe, the dilemma is acute. Respond too softly, and you normalize economic coercion within alliances. Respond too aggressively, and you risk accelerating a trade confrontation that damages growth, energy stability, and political unity. This is why European messaging has been careful, firm, but controlled. The EU is trying to resist pressure without triggering a spiral it did not choose. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Once tariffs enter the strategic arena, neutrality disappears. Every decision becomes a signal. Silence becomes acquiescence. Delay becomes vulnerability. Even restraint is interpreted as calculation, not goodwill. This is also why the Arctic looms so large in this story. The region is no longer peripheral. It is where military planning, climate change, resource competition, and global trade routes converge. Whoever shapes the Arctic's governance today shapes the balance of power tomorrow. Greenland is not valuable because of what it is. It is valuable because of what it enables. And that brings us to the deeper risk. When strategic urgency rises, tolerance for ambiguity falls. Allies are expected to align faster. Objections are reframed as obstacles. Economic tools become shortcuts around political resistance. This compresses decision-making timelines and increases the probability of miscalculation. History shows that alliances break not from hostility, but from accumulated pressure, not from dramatic betrayals, but from repeated moments where interests diverge and coercion replaces trust. Each incident alone seems manageable. Together, they rewrite behavior. What makes this moment particularly fragile is that it unfolds in an era already defined by erosion. Erosion of norms, erosion of institutions, erosion of predictability. When established partners begin testing each other's red lines through economic force, the system absorbs the shock, but it also remembers it. And the world is watching. Not just governments, but corporations, investors, and emerging powers. They are learning where pressure works, where unity holds, and where cracks appear. These lessons will be applied elsewhere, in different contexts, long after Greenland fades from headlines. So this is not a story about tariffs alone. It is a story about how power is evolving, quieter, sharper, and more conditional. It is about how strategic geography is returning to center stage, not through conquest, but through leverage. And it is about how alliances are being tested not by enemies, but by the methods their members are willing to use. Greenland did not change overnight, but the way the world talks about it and uses it did. And once that shift occurs, it doesn't reverse easily because the most consequential changes in geopolitics are not announced. They are practiced. And this one is being practiced right now. And the long-term consequences of that practice are where this story truly deepens. Because once economic pressure proves effective, even once, it reshapes strategic thinking everywhere. Policymakers begin to ask not whether leverage should be used, but why it shouldn't. The threshold lowers. What was once extraordinary becomes acceptable. What was once risky becomes routine. And over time, restraint starts to look like weakness rather than wisdom. For Europe, this moment is forcing a painful internal audit. The EU has long relied on rules, institutions, and predictability as shields. But rules only protect those who can enforce them, and predictability only works when all sides value stability equally. The Greenland episode exposes a gap between Europe's normative power and the hard leverage now shaping global politics. That gap is uncomfortable and dangerous if left unaddressed. This is why discussions inside European capitals are quietly shifting from reaction to resilience. Supply chains, strategic industries, trade defenses, autonomy. These conversations are no longer theoretical. They are being accelerated by the realization that dependence can be exploited even among partners. Once that realization sets in, policy direction hardens, regardless of who occupies leadership positions later. From Washington's angle, there is a belief that this pressure is manageable, that Europe will protest, posture, but ultimately adjust. That belief rests on history, decades of alignment, shared security architecture, and economic interdependence. But history is not a guarantee. It is a context, and contexts change when incentives change. The danger lies in misreading adaptation as submission. Europe may comply tactically while restructuring strategically. That kind of shift doesn't make headlines, but it alters balance over time. When partners quietly reduce exposure, diversify dependencies, and build buffers, influence erodes invisibly. And then there's the psychological dimension. Trust, once strained, does not reset with a press release. It lingers in future negotiations. It colors assumptions. It shortens patience. Each new disagreement is interpreted through the memory of the last one. This is how relationships degrade without formally breaking. Greenland, again, remains the silent constant. Its strategic value is increasing regardless of political friction. Arctic routes will continue opening. Military planners will continue recalibrating. Competition will continue intensifying. The question is not whether Greenland matters, it's whether the struggle around it becomes cooperative or coercive. If coercion becomes the dominant mode, the Arctic risks becoming a zone of pressure rather than stability. That has implications far beyond Europe and the United States. It affects global shipping norms, environmental governance, indigenous rights, and crisis management in one of the world's most fragile regions. And that brings us to the final unsettling realization. This episode may be remembered less for what happened and more for what it revealed. It revealed that alliances are entering an era where alignment is enforced, not assumed, where economics is no longer a cushion against conflict, but a conduit for it, and where geography, cold, distant, and unforgiving, is once again shaping the logic of power. Nothing has exploded. No treaty has collapsed. No alliance has formally fractured. And yet something fundamental has shifted. The world did not wake up to a crisis. It is slowly adjusting to a new normal, one where pressure speaks louder than partnership, and where even allies must now calculate the cost of saying no. And that is why this story doesn't end with Greenland. It begins there. And the most telling sign that this is only the beginning is how calmly everyone is behaving on the surface. There is no panic because panic would imply surprise. What we are seeing instead is recognition. Recognition that this is the direction power has been drifting toward for years, and that Greenland is simply the moment where the drift becomes visible. Leaders on both sides understand that walking this back entirely is unlikely. The question now is how far it goes and who blinks first. What's unfolding here fits a broader pattern: strategic impatience. Major powers no longer believe they have the luxury of waiting for consensus. Climate timelines are accelerating. Military technologies are compressing reaction windows. Supply chains are being reshored or weaponized. In that environment, slow diplomacy feels outdated. Pressure delivers faster results, and at least in the short term, but speed comes at a cost. When pressure replaces persuasion, compliance becomes brittle. It holds only as long as the pressure does. The moment conditions change, the resentment surfaces. History is full of examples where forced alignment produced temporary order and long-term instability. The danger is assuming this time is different because the tools are economic rather than military. For Europe, the Greenland tariffs force a generational choice. Does it double down on the transatlantic bond as the anchor of its security, accepting asymmetry as the price of protection? Or does it accelerate towards strategic independence, even if that path is costly, fragmented, and politically painful? Neither option is clean. Both carry risk, and the longer pressure persists, the narrower the middle ground becomes. For the United States, the gamble is that leverage strengthens leadership, that demonstrating willingness to impose costs will deter future resistance and streamline alignment. But leadership sustained by pressure requires constant reinforcement. It creates a cycle where backing off becomes harder than escalating because credibility becomes tied to toughness rather than trust. And that is where miscalculation creeps in, because allies do not respond like adversaries. They adapt quietly. They hedge. They comply publicly while recalibrating privately. Influence fades not through rebellion, but through redundancy. When alternatives are built, leverage weakens. And by the time that weakness is visible, it's already too late to reverse. Greenland's strategic gravity will only intensify this dynamic. As Arctic competition sharpens, every decision around the island will be scrutinized, politicized, and leveraged. Environmental cooperation, military coordination, investment flows all become arenas for signaling. Stability becomes harder to maintain precisely because the stakes are so high. What makes this moment uniquely fragile is that it sits at the intersection of three forces: economic coercion, alliance strain, and territorial strategy. Each on its own is manageable. Together, they create feedback loops that amplify tension even when no one intends escalation. And that is how systems slide into confrontation without choosing it. This is why the Greenland tariffs matter, even if they are delayed, diluted, or withdrawn. The act itself has already done its work. It has shown what tools are now considered acceptable. It has revealed how far pressure is willing to go. And it has reminded every actor watching that in the emerging order, nothing, not trade, not alliances, not geography, is insulated from power politics. The frozen island did not change. The world around it did. And once that realization sets in, no policy reversal can fully undo it because the lesson has already been learned. And this is where the story settles, not with a resolution, but with a realization. What began as a tariff threat tied to a distant Arctic island has evolved into something far more revealing, a glimpse of how power now moves in the world, quietly, indirectly, through pressure instead of persuasion, through economics instead of armies, through leverage instead of loyalty. Greenland did not choose to become a focal point of global tension, yet its geography has pulled it into the center of a shifting order where alliances are tested not by enemies, but by expectations, where saying no carries a price, and where cooperation increasingly depends on cost calculations rather than shared values. The United States may see this as strategic efficiency. Europe may see it as a warning. The rest of the world sees it as a signal that the era of predictable partnerships is fading, replaced by a colder logic where alignment must be continuously proven. Nothing dramatic may happen next. Tariffs may be delayed, statements may soften, markets may move on, but the underlying change remains. The line between economic policy and strategic coercion has blurred, and once blurred, it rarely sharpens again. This is how geopolitical eras end. Not with collapse, but with subtle shifts in behavior that redefine what is acceptable. What was unthinkable becomes normal. What was exceptional became routine. So when future historians look back at this moment, they may not focus on the tariff numbers or the diplomatic exchanges. They may focus on the lesson everyone absorbed without saying it out loud, that in the new global order, even allies must weigh the cost of independence. And that is the quiet power of this story. Not that Greenland was contested, but that pressure, once used, became part of the language of leadership. And that's the real update, brought to you here on Strategic Geopolitics Brief, where we don't chase headlines, we decode what they truly mean.